Hi, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. I know you're all very eager to sit down and stop talking to each other and listen to us. So I'm going to ask you to do that now. We're going to introduce ourselves briefly. My name is Hannah Brown. I work as the Science Communication Specialist for the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Natalia Shaw. I work with the New Mexico Forest and Watershed Restoration Institute, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator.
Our session this afternoon after lunch, basically, I know that we're all in this position where we have 99 or more problems that we are facing at any given moment. And some of those problems feel really unique and individual when we're going through them. However, we find that we share the challenges that we are facing. We're operating in systems that are new and unprecedented, at the same time not, because somebody across the country may have the same issue that you're having right now. And we wanted to design this session to really be a chance to focus on the problems that we are experiencing. So sometimes we can shy away from talking about that stuff. We feel a little nervous and scared to make ourselves vulnerable to talk about the things that are going wrong. But that's what we're going to do this afternoon. So get ready to talk about everything that is challenging in your job. Natalia is going to introduce our case study speakers.
Yeah, so we have a great panel organized for you all today. So we're going to start from your left to right. We have Bob Sturtevant. He's currently the conservation chair for the Delatour Scout Ranch, and he's also taught at CSU Fort Collins. He has a lengthy career with Colorado State Forestry, and he has a background in forest and fire management. And he was really crucial in reintroducing fire to the Scout Ranch. And so next we have Jay Smith, coming from Arizona, who works for the Coconino County Forest Restoration. He's the director, and he works in the flood control district. And so Jay has worked in the forest industry for about 25 years, overseeing logging and sawmill operations in the southeast and southwest United States. And he's currently working to develop and implement the county's forest restoration initiative. And then we have Daniel Denipah. He's the director of the Santa Clara Pueblo Forestry in New Mexico. And Daniel has worked in forestry and wildland operations for over 30 years, and currently oversees operations related to fire management, reforestation, watershed restoration, co-stewardship of cross-boundary landscapes. And last but not least, we have Sarah McCaffrey. She is a social scientist, recently retired from the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and she's done social science related to public perceptions of restoration and prescribed fire. So she's helped inform greatly how the public interacts with land and how land managers are interacting with policy. So her career has helped land managers understand how stakeholders are interacting with local landscapes. And this is the panel we have for you all. They'll each take a turn to speak and share some of their stories with you all.
So we're going to start with Bob.
Was this somebody else's? Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I know this is not a newsflash, but doing forest restoration on private land has a lot of challenges. Now, I know my talk was supposed to be about escape fire, and I'll get to that, but there's a lot more to it. I'm coming from the perspective as a forester that's worked in private land management for his career. But I'm going to use a case study of the Delatour Scout Ranch to emphasize some of the issues we have. I've been working with the Scout Ranch for the past 37 years. It's a 3,200 acre parcel, 40 miles northwest of Fort Collins. Now, according to the Colorado State Forest Service, there's 186,000 private landowners in Colorado with forested land. New Mexico has 81,000. Arizona, 45,000. It's over 300,000 private landowners that have forestry issues. So let's talk about some of these challenges that we have as private landowners. Challenge one, how do private landowners access the resources needed to do forest restoration? It's expensive, requires equipment, and it requires personnel. So as private landowners, we need money, equipment, personnel. The good news is in the early 2000s, we had some pretty major fires. And Congress acted. They sent out money for us. We did pretty well as a camp, as a ranch. 3,200 acres, conservation easement, and we're right next to a subdivision with 1,500 houses. So yeah, we were important, and they gave us some money. But what about some of the smaller landowners? Those in maybe some of the WUI that are in a subdivision, half acre, 5 acres. How do they access this money and this ability to do the work? Challenge number 2. A lot of these grants require a match. Our grants average around $40,000. $40,000 we received, but we had to provide $40,000. That's tough. We were lucky. We're a scout camp. We have built-in volunteers. Most private landowners don't have that access to people. Challenge number 3. What do we do with the wood? We were lucky. We had a grant that allowed us to get a sawmill and a wood splitter. And we could use a lot of that wood, but not all of it, not even most of it. So we have piles of wood left over. Had we been closer to Fort Collins or Denver, maybe we could get people to come get it, but we can't. The mills don't want it. It's not what they want. What do we do with the wood? It's there. Challenge 4, you cut a tree down, what do you get? You get some wood, but you get a lot of slash. What do you do with the slash? As a camp, we can't just lop and scatter. It remains a fire hazard, and it's a tripping hazard for our kids. So what do? We pile it up, wait till the snow falls, and occasionally it does fall, but not as much as it used to, and we burn it. Problem solved. Except here in Larimer County, we're restricted to 50 piles per year that we can burn. We generate 200, 300 a year. Do the math. It doesn't work out. So we keep accumulating slash piles. Come along to 2012, High Park Fire, 90,000 acres, right near us in the subdivision. It burned part of our subdivision next to us, and bad things happened. We had the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed that was created because of that. Their goal was to replant as much as possible, restore the fire burn, and start doing mitigation. They needed a place to do that, to get started. And I said, we have a place, come on up. And they did. And the coalition started gathering people. Nature Conservancy, Denipah County Conservation Crew, Wildland Restoration Volunteers, Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, Denipah County Soil Conservation District, GOCO, Anheuser-Busch, Patagonia. We all got together, started working on the property. Great thing was Nature Conservancy could get a state permit and we could burn more slash piles. In fact, we could burn all the slash piles that we could generate. Good news. There's the Denipah County crew, hard at work, or taking a break rather. After a couple years of thinning, we said, hey, let's do some burning. And we started a prescribed fire. 150 acres, went great. A couple more years of thinning, started a new fire. This time 500 acres. 2 days, day one, great. Day two, started out great. Wind came up, ember came across the line, got into cheatgrass and took off. I told you about that 1,500 housing unit to our east. It went there and burned a shed and some trees. Challenge number 5, how to recover from an escape fire. Some of our neighbors will never forgive us. There was lawsuits, there was the loss of our fire module. They were disbanded because of the fire. They lost maybe $500,000 in claims. And we had a black eye. We lost this important tool. 2023, because of more fires, more escape fires in the nation, most of our cooperators now cannot get insurance to do prescribed fire. We have lost that tool, and hopefully it's just temporary, but we need to figure out how to get these people insured so they can put fire back on the land. This is what we're aiming for, a restored forest. Private landowners have a difficulty getting to this point without the help of all of us, the money, the knowledge, the personnel, the equipment. Hopefully, in our sessions, we can discuss how we can get more of these resources to the people that need it, the 312,000 just in our 3 states. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon. Jay Smith, I'm the Forest Restoration Director for Coconino County Flood Control District. And the first question I always get is, Why does a county flood control district have a forester? Well, let me show you. I wish you could hear the sound, because you can hear the boulders coming down. This was a result of the pipeline fire last summer in Coconino County. This is taken from the front steps of a house in a neighborhood that lost 30 homes from the tunnel fire a few weeks before. This was a 5-year flood event that hit this watershed. We're talking 0.87 inches of rain in 15 minutes. That's all to do that. So why does the flood control district have a forester on staff? Well, you can see the number of fires that we've had just in the last 10 to 15 years and the destruction it's done across our county. So what do we do as a result? Well, we looked at, in 2018, how do we start to make a difference? So in 2017, our Board of Supervisors, our elected officials, deemed catastrophic wildfire and post-wildfire flooding as the #1 safety threat for our communities. And in so doing, they started the Forest Restoration Initiative. So 2018, we have the Farm Bill that includes now the GNA, Good Neighbor Authority, for counties. So we thought this will be great. We can start now impacting the federal lands around us that are going to flood, but we got to know where those areas are. So we did a FEMA-funded study in 2017, told us where's our most critical areas. Then we added that, and it showed some major areas in Bill Williams Mountain, or just south of the town of Williams, small town in rural Coconino County, and you had a big area just north of Flagstaff. Well, we had some work going on there through the city of Flagstaff, so we chose Bill Williams as our priority project. We identified 1,600 acres of steep slopes that were right above the city, the watershed. They pretty much live in the alluvial fan. But it's going to cost $25 to $30 million to treat 1,600 acres because it's going to be helicopter logged. Where do you come up with those? Why has the Forest Service never looked at this? Oh, they've been told, treat more acres. We're giving you dollars, treat more acres. Well, you're only going to treat 1,600 acres for $30 million? No politician wants to live with that. So we had to try to change their mind on how to do it and bring dollars to the table. We also did a study that said if the mountain burns and we have post-fire flooding, a monsoonal event, you're going to have up to $700 million of economic impact to that area. Now you look at $30 million versus $700 million, now the numbers start to make a little sense. So we approached the Kaibab National Forest as a county, said we want to do some work under GNA. Very trepidation. They did not want to talk to us. They were not ready to jump into allowing a county to come in and manage federal land. So I sat there and scratched my head for a little bit. How am I going to deal with this if they're not even going to talk to me about this? And I'd never heard of National Forest Foundation. But I got introduced to Spencer Plum, and he and I went together to the Kaibab, and you'd have thought I was their best friend all of a sudden now. I mean, they were ready to sit down, talk. You have the National Forest Foundation here? Yeah. We've got a partnership here that we can work with. We'll let them manage this project for us. That apprehension just went away. They also had, because we had to figure out a funding mechanism for all of this. How do we get federal dollars, state dollars, grant dollars? All this stuff is coming together. How do we put that into a pool to spend? They had a challenge cost share agreement. Never heard of that before in my life. What a wonderful tool. We can all give our money to NFF. They then manage the contract, and they hire and deal with the contractors and pay the contractors. So now we had to write prescriptions, get the RFPs out, sign a contract. I never knew the impact it would be to have NFF come in. Do you know how many pages a typical Forest Service contract is for timber removal? 200 plus pages. I mean, it's a booklet. NFF's, we were under 20 pages It's amazing. And the loggers loved it. They don't have to deal with this 200-page contract. They got 20 pages. And NFF builds a layer between them and the green suits. They don't have to deal with the Forest Service as much. They deal with NFF. So two huge things that we were able to get some boundaries there. So we're 5 years into this project. We've treated 474 acres. We got 285 acres under contract currently that we're working on. We have about 800 acres left. This has been a success in my book because when we started this project, the museum fire hit just north of Flagstaff. 2,000 acre, tiny fire, huge impact to the community in post-fire flooding. They had done helicopter logging as well. They didn't have the funding to remove the dead and down and all the slash, so they left it there hoping the fire wouldn't come, and it came. We learned that lesson. We now only treat the acres that we can remove everything off of, dead and down. We have dead and down on this mountain that is upwards of 60 to 80 tons per acre, just of dead and down. And we got to figure out how do we get that off the mountain. So that was a huge hurdle that we had to come up with. So as we're learning from these contracts and we're learning how to adapt and get the costs and understand all these things, why did we do all this? It was so we could sleep at night. Because one morning, 2 years ago, I got the phone call from the district ranger at 6 a.m. saying, we got a fire on Bill Williams Mountain. Lightning struck a tree in one of the units that we treated. She's like, but don't worry, because we sent a crew up there. They put a line around it. There was no fuels for it to burn, and it's pretty much taken care of. Now, a year before, that could have been a devastating fire because one, they wouldn't even have put crews on the mountain. It's too dangerous. And so now we can actually attack a small lightning strike because we had removed all the fuel. So how do we afford to do this? You know, I get the question, why is the county spending money, taxpayer dollars, on federal lands? I've already paid taxes to do that. Why are we spending more taxes? Well, you can see by the flooding that I showed there, that it is costing the county millions of dollars every time we have to deal with the post-fire flooding because the fire burns federal land, the floods come down to county jurisdiction, and now we have to pay for that. And we will not remain solvent if this continues to happen. So we went into our flood control district to a secondary property tax and was able to bring money to the table in a tune of up to $6 million a year to treat these acres to be able to protect our communities. We are the second largest county in the lower 48, but we only have 145,000 people that live there. So it's a hit, and people have to know that what we're doing is worthwhile, which is why we continue to back it with science and with statistics on what is the economic impact if we don't treat these areas and reduce these catastrophic fires. My goal in all of this is to be able to allow the Forest Service to feel comfortable about putting fire back on Bill Williams Mountain and other areas that we treat. Because before, they would never, ever even think of lighting a prescribed fire on that mountain. Now, they're able to look and say, oh, we've reduced the fuel loading so much, we can back a fire down that mountain. We can now bring fire back into this system. So the fruits of our labor, not just the groundwork, but being successful in getting social license not only to treat forested areas, to treat steep slope areas, but also to be able to bring that fire back and show people fire plays a role in the ponderosa pine ecosystem, even in a dry mixed conifer ecosystem. When you have dead and down at 60, 70, 80 tons per acre, we can bring it back safely once we remove that fuel. Am I done? We got 1 minute. So, you know, to me, I grew up, I ran logging operations, I ran sawmills. I was in industry, and that's where I wanted to be. I went to the dark side of government, and I feel like in the last 4 years of being in government, I've made more of an impact on northern Arizona than I did in the 5 to 7 years I was running logging operations in that area. So thank you all, I appreciate it, and be glad to answer questions during the breakout sessions.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel Denipah. I'm the Director of Forestry for Santa Clara, Pueblo. And glad to be here and share some of our challenges that we have at Santa Clara. If you look at the slides here, back in 2005, we had a pristine pond, fourth pond, up in our headwaters area. And you can tell there is a nice forest. It didn't, not to say it didn't have its problems with, being overstocked and a couple of insects and disease stuff that was going on there. And that kind of led up to the fires that we were having there and some of the impacts. Santa Clara has had, about 4 major fires run through it that actually added up to about 90% of the watershed being impacted up there and actually lost. We had, during the Los Conchas fire, we actually had 100% fish kill from all the sediment and all the logs and everything that settled in the bottom of that stuff. So even with the last fire that we had, the Los Conchas, quickly the tribal council and the governor realized that there was an issue with the youth, and the youth actually being disconnected from the land because we had to shut that area down. The canyon area was actually shut down to all the tribal members and the community members as well, so nobody could actually go up there. Other than our crews to go up there and start repairing some of those areas and taking some of that stuff out. So the tribe, like I had mentioned, was worried about the youth being disconnected. And when we talk about being disconnected from the land, the tribe holds that land dearly to them because it's a part of their traditional and cultural practices. A lot of the stuff that they utilize comes from that area. So once you lose it, you kind of lose that perspective and you lose the youth to it as well. As far as their identification and who they are as people, as Tewa people. And one of the things is that their Tewa language, that's the glue of the people there. And they're still fluent in the Tewa language, which is good. And that extends back again into the youth. And knowing that was one of the challenges is we needed to get the youth back up there, but how could we do it safely without any impact? So we worked with the schools. One was the Santa Fe Indian School and then the local Capo Community School. Some of the challenges we had there, of course, was the liability. How do you put these students in there? You can't put a chainsaw in their hand and expect them to go up there and start cutting this stuff out. But you can find creative ways for them to do stuff by moving logs. Of course, we're not going to put them on a steep slope or anything like that, but we had these small structures that they could build and they could be a part of. Also with the planting, they were able to actually get up there, do some cone collection, process the seeds, and actually watch them go into the propagation and then eventually start planting some of the stuff that was going up there. So that was one of the ways we tried to reconnect the youth back to the land. And if we take another look at this slide, this shows the Los Conchas fire, pre-fire. You can see with that picture there on the right, how pristine and nice it was, a nice wooded area. And now you have post-fire 2013. A lot of when I talk about 90% of that watershed being lost, now you can see why. A lot of those trees that are there are no longer there. The past wind events and everything else have actually created more of a mess for us. The post-fire flooding that happened, actually, we had about 27 smaller drainages connected to the main drainage that was actually pushing a lot of sediment down into the creek. And like I had mentioned, filled up rather quickly and resulted in 100% fish kill. Again, going back to the history of that place and how strong of a connection the people actually were tied to that land. When I tell you that was more like their biological classroom. That was also their learning place, learning about places of their history and who they are as people, because that's important to them. They can't just pick up and move somewhere because this is their homelands. This is where they've always been. This is where they've provided for their families through hunting, through fishing, through collection of certain forest products that were either for healing or for cultural practices. So we had Santa Clara Pueblo wildfire, flash flooding. Of course, we had a lot of erosion, the sediment deposition. We also had a lot of woody debris mixed in with that. And we kind of came up with the use of nature-based solutions. So quickly after the fire, we gathered up all the stakeholders and all of our collaborators and used the national framework that they had to actually come up with some ideas on how we were going to come up with the funding, but also the resources to get some of this work done. And of course, those challenges you can look at is the permitting aspect of everything, because we had to work inside those stream areas and build some structures there to stop that, to slow down the sediment deposition, but also the cutting that was going on in there, some of the erosion that we were seeing. And you can kind of see from this lower left-hand picture right there is part of our fire crew. These folks had to hike in. When you're hiking, you have a 2-hour drive up to get to the spot. Then you have another 2 hours to hike into that spot. You get maybe about 3 or 4 work hours out of that, and then you have to come back out. So access was another big challenge for us. But our crews managed. And they actually got up there and they were able to build about 17,000 structures in 27 of these tributaries that came down, and actually slowed a lot of that sediment deposition. And actually, we're seeing a lot of good stuff come out of it. Right now, we're concentrating on the main stem of the creek, trying to repair a lot of it, get some of the sediment back out of it, a lot of that woody debris. Again, we're looking at some of that stuff that was left over. Well, what do we do with it? Came up with a creative way and looking at nature-based solutions. Using the logs that were out there, using some of those rocks that, of course, I seen in one of the slides there, you see a lot of rocks that came down. One of the early things they were telling us was rocks don't float. Well, try telling that to the flood. So we had issues ourselves. Again, going back, we had to constantly repair a lot of the stuff that was out there, the stream channel itself, cleaning out some of those places that we had, a lot of heavy equipment work, trying to repair the stream and getting it back to flowing where it should be. One was the road access was completely destroyed up in some of those areas, so we had to use some of that equipment to repair the roads. And right now, we're looking at some of our long-term treatments, and we still haven't put a permanent road in. We're still trying to figure out ways to do that. And of course, Mother Nature helped us out this past year. She threw a couple more floods at us, and kind of told us exactly where those roads were going to be washed out and stuff. So it kind of gave us a better idea of where we should be concentrating and putting some of our efforts at. This is a result of one of our equipment. Soon after the Los Conchas fire and one of the biggest floods that we had there, we had some folks trapped up there. And we had actually one piece of heavy equipment that was buried from the sediment. At this point, we were actually hiked up to that area. We found the equipment, and after the several more of those flood events, that piece of machinery was completely covered from top to bottom. It took us about 5 years to actually get that out and up to a point where we could dig it out and actually take it out of the ground. And that just kind of shows you a little bit of the disasters and challenges that we've had. You know, kind of looking at it, and that's why some of the community members were actually excluded from going up there, is because we had identified a 3-mile stretch within that canyon that was just way too dangerous to be putting people up there, and our evacuation time wouldn't allow us to get folks out in time, because there's only one way in and only one way out. So that was one of our problems. Again, looking at the path to the future, you know, again, referring back to the kids, we're still looking at ways right now to involve the kids, get them more involved with the restoration work, a lot of the planting and stuff, and hopefully getting these kids reconnected back to the land. Like I had mentioned, it's culturally important, especially for the tribal youth there, that they don't lose that perspective of things, especially when it's ingrained in them through their traditions, their cultural practices, their songs, and identifies who they are. And that's why we're doing this. It's not just for ourselves, but it's for the future of the children and for the people there, so that they can continue to enjoy this and prosper out of that, and live to see not only more of those challenges, but hopefully progress into fixing some of that places. And, you know, rather than looking at it as something that's bad, you know, we try to find some good out of it, and saying maybe there's an opportunity now for us to fix it a little bit better and put things back the way they should be, and getting it ready for the future generations. But like I had mentioned, that's just our partnership with the Pueblo Community School. That's the 5th grade class. But we also work in tandem with the Santa Fe Indian School. So we follow those folks all the way from the 1st grade all the way up to their high school years, because a lot of those Indian students move on to that Santa Fe Indian School. So that's where the way we're able to kind of track them and get them involved all the way up through their life history there, and putting together something so hopefully eventually in the future they'll be interested in taking on the work from us, and taking on some of those challenges that we have today. Thank you guys again for letting me share my experience with you, and what we do at Santa Clara Pueblo. So thank you.
Well, this is a lovely opportunity to come back to my old crowd. And I'm super excited to see so many people out there and so many new, young, fresh faces getting involved in these topics. I'm not going to focus on a specific set of problems. As a social scientist, what we do is we study how other people deal with problems. So what I'm going to focus on more is sort of some guidelines that I have sort of seen across different case studies and different groups that might be used for thinking about how to both confront novel challenges, but also to think about how to deal with working cross-boundary on land management and resource management issues. So I'm sort of pulling from 2 case studies and a general wealth of knowledge from the 2 ends of my career. So the first is from my work on my dissertation, which was on Incline Village, Nevada, where they started working with their homeowners in 1988. And their work there has since expanded to something that I would think of as a cross-boundary landscape effort around the Lake Tahoe Basin. And then the other one is the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. And I had been sort of thinking, how am I going to talk about it? And then I saw this lovely graphic, which I think does a really excellent job of sort of summarizing the process of thinking about cross-boundary and some of the things to think about. And to their credit, they have multiple versions of it, the sort of simplified, and they have another one with much more detail. But it illustrates sort of that this is a cyclical process, that there's multiple steps. Where I first saw this was at the Fire Adapted Colorado workshop, where they had different partners in that, and they all talked about what was really interesting. They talked about how they were each at different stages in this cycle, and where they were and which processes they had accomplished, which I think illustrates a really nice point, that this is very much of an iterative process, an adaptive process. And so what I'm going to focus on is 4 kind of guidelines, which I've seen kind of are guiding threads between different aspects of these periods and in general thinking about cross-boundary. And those are sort of a guideline to always be interactive and listen. And this is the basic thing. If you're working cross-boundary, you have to have conversations. If you want to get to this point where you're co-developing best practices or you're developing a shared vision, you cannot do that unless you're having a conversation, unless you're listening. You cannot walk into a crowd and say, here's our vision, now it's shared. No, that's not how it works. You have to have a conversation. You have to listen. So that's an integral part of any cross-boundary work and of many, many of these steps that are there. The second one is about scaling and working incrementally, and they kind of go together. One of the sort of well-established ideas of how you change behavior is start incrementally. Start with something that's small, that you can try out, you can test, you can see what works, what doesn't work, and you can demonstrate what works. And in both Incline Village and here, you can sort of see that happen. In Incline Village, they really did start with Incline Village. And that was the local fire department that just started working within their organization to start not just going out and putting out fires, but start doing fuels treatments, talking with homeowners, and engaging the community in developing a more fire resilient community. And here, for the collaborative, they started with one ranger district. And they sort of worked on that and developing partnerships and establishing a shared vision for that group and those things. And so they figured out what worked, and as they've gone, they've sort of expanded. They've added in fire, they've operated on watershed scales, and so they've added in watersheds all the way down to I-70 for their entire collaborative. So they've expanded the scale over time, and they can adjust and pick up the lessons learned from the previous group and adapt it to their needs. So the flexibility is incremental. And with Incline Village, as the firefighters in that fire department got jobs at other fire districts around the basin, they sort of brought their vision of a different way of being a fire department to those other fire departments around Lake Tahoe. And part of what the fire department did was build relationships with all the different entities. And so over time, that's expanded to be this whole organization around Lake Tahoe of all the different agencies, all the different fire departments that are all working together to develop a more fire resilient landscape and ability to live with fire in the Lake Tahoe basin. So over time, they've sort of incrementally expanded it to this, what is now this phenomenal scale. The next one is to diversify. And this is diversify from a whole bunch of levels. You see it here in terms of diversifying your funding, and we heard a little bit about that. We also heard about diversifying capacity. So it's diversifying your workforce. Who are you pulling on? What organizations are you pulling from? And how are you doing it? And diversifying your processes, maybe. So we also heard like maybe a good way to go about it isn't by a process with the Forest Service, but with the National Forest Foundation. Maybe that's actually a more effective way to get the work done. And the other thing I would say that's really important is to diversify perspectives. And so too often we get really narrowly focused on a problem, and if we get somebody from a different perspective at the table, they often have a different angle of how they see that problem, and also potentially how they're going to see solutions to that problem. So diversifying perspectives, I think, is a really important goal in solving problems, and particularly in solving novel problems. Because oftentimes our barrier to solving a problem is that we just are stuck in how we see it. So diversifying perspective is key. And then the final one is one that I think we don't think a lot about, but I think is really critical if we want to accomplish this one about sustained momentum. A lot of effort goes into a lot of projects, and over time they die. And some of them die appropriately because they've accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. But most of these efforts are things that we really want to keep going. And so then I think we need to be thinking as early as possible, how do we institutionalize these processes? So you see that a little bit here in this one in terms of critical paid positions. This is not something we can expect just individuals on their own motivation to volunteer for, or potentially, oh, I'm going to take this on as an added job responsibility. It needs to get institutionalized as a set of roles, a set of responsibilities, and across organizations. And I learned this one most clearly when I was looking at Incline Village several years afterwards. And so they had the fire department started. The fire chief was kind of the instigator. He really made it happen. He sort of forced everything to happen, got around the firefighter unions to make things happen. But when he retired, and they got a new fire chief who wasn't quite on board, it kind of slowly atrophied. But there was one person there who sort of carried the flag until they got a new fire chief who was like on board with it. But what they had learned was that you can't depend on a program to be dependent on one person's motivation. And they'd also had one person who was responsible for sort of establishing all those relationships with the different Forest Service and Nevada Department of Forestry. And so what they realized is we can't depend on that, because if that person gets another job, we have to rebuild all those relationships. So then they, I thought quite smartly, assigned a relationship with different agencies to each firefighter. You are responsible for working with the Forest Service. You are responsible for working with the Nevada Department of Forestry. You are responsible for working with CDF. And what that meant was when you had a firefighter move on, you only had one set of relationships to reestablish. And so you basically institutionalized the program as a whole because you didn't have sort of a single weak point. And that kind of really made it clear to me, like, how we need to think about how do we make sure that this doesn't disappear when the funding goes away. So diversify your funding so you're not dependent on one source. But when one person goes away or one process. And they're thinking about that in this thing too, in terms of diversify funding, paid resources on the longer, more detailed one. They have institutionalized expectations and processes, so they're engaging in that. 5 minutes. What? Okay, good, because I was about to say, oh wow, I went way faster than I thought I did. So I will close with two thoughts. One of the other points that on incremental and sort of institutionalizing that I think the cooperative did well was they developed sort of a messaging system, a list of extensive messages about what this is trying to accomplish for, prescribed fire, ecologically speaking, watershed, et cetera. And they identified first really detailed messages, then a set of sort of here's the more core parts, and then here's our sort of elevator messages. And I thought I've seen that to be super useful because it gives the partners that you bring on board sort of a detailed idea of here's what we're thinking, and then they can pull which message works best for them. So you're not tying them to this is the messaging we all have to use except for at this sort of high level. And the final point I'll end on is one guideline that's not in here that I think is worth thinking about a lot more is equity. Are what we're coming up with treating everybody as having equal value in this situation? Sometimes we have sort of one partner in the room who sort of tries to control the conversation too much or has too much power. And are we sort of accounting for that and making sure all voices at the table are heard?
Thank you so much. Can we just give all of our panelists another hand? Thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. I am momentarily going to release you to your breakout groups, so just keep all of those burning thoughts inside until you get to your room, and then please share them. You will see some room numbers on your agenda for today. The session is Sharing Novel Challenges. You are free to self-distribute to these rooms, which you can find down this hall and then both directions, just like the bathrooms Tony directed you to earlier this morning. Maybe consider not going to a room with all of your best friends and talking to some new folks. Facilitators, you will find all of your information in a folder in the room. Note takers, same thing. You are free. Thank you.